Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. As you can see behind me, we've pretty much reached the end, at least the end of the regular gardening season here in Connecticut. It's getting into early to mid-October, and as you can see, the garden is not looking as beautiful as it was earlier this season. But the garden does still have some actually pretty important harvests for us. We are going to actually go out in this garden today and we are going to collect a lot of seeds. Now, saving seeds is something that I have really been making more of a priority in the past couple gardening seasons. If you are gardening for the purposes of increasing sustainability, increasing self-sufficiency, seed saving is one of those skills that I think is really important to develop. If you are gardening for the purposes of saving money, again, seed saving will help you save a lot of money in your garden. So being able to grow and cultivate your own food is such an important life skill, especially nowadays with everything getting so expensive and everything has just been really kind of uncertain in a lot of ways. So I think that learning to grow your own food is so valuable. But the reality is that the more things that you are dependent on outside resources for, the less sustainable you really are. And that's been something I've been trying to address in my garden. I've been trying to increase my sustainability by reducing my dependence on a lot of outside resources, like for example, seed companies. Now, I love buying seeds. I will always buy seeds just because I like to grow a lot of variety, and there's no way I could realistically save seeds for everything that I want to grow. But I do save enough seeds that I know if something ever happened, if there was some sort of seed shortage or some sort of issue where I wasn't able to get seeds from my favorite seed companies, I know that I have enough of my own seeds that I can at least grow food for myself. So I think that that's something that is a really important skill to develop, and honestly it's a lot easier and probably a lot less mysterious than a lot of people think. So let's take a little walk through the garden. Let's see what seeds we can find to collect in the garden right now, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the seeds that I've already collected and saved earlier this year. So here you can see my green bean tunnels. They are certainly not as beautiful or magical as they were earlier this season, but they do still have a lot to offer us in the form of bean seeds. We had a really abundant green bean harvest this season, and honestly, we had so many green beans that I couldn't really keep up with the harvest. There were days when we kind of had green beans for many days in a row, didn't really want them for dinner that night. I missed a couple days harvesting, and many of my beans really got overgrown. So at that point, a lot of them were kind of past the point of being a really enjoyable harvest. We didn't really want to eat them. So I had a couple options at that point. I could have either pulled off the beans that were a little bit overgrown and just composted them in the hopes that that would kind of stimulate the plants to produce a new crop of beans that would be a little bit more young and tender. Or I could let them continue going to maturity and then get some seeds from them. So this year, because we'd had so many green beans already, I opted to let some of them go to seed. We were harvesting lots of other things from the garden, and I decided that harvesting the seeds would be more valuable than taking the chance of getting a second harvest. Now, when you're saving seeds from something like beans, you're going to have to let the beans really mature past the point. Now, see this bean here? This is a nice tender bean. This would be delicious to eat fresh, as opposed to this bean here. This bean would be tough and stringy and not really desirable for eating. If you want to harvest green beans for the purpose of seeds, you're going to have to let them go really past the point at which you'd actually want to eat them. You're going to have to let them go to what the plant considers maturity, as opposed to what we, as the gardener or as the cook, would consider maturity. One of the biggest things to really get used to if you're growing a plant for the purpose of saving seeds is to recognize the difference between what the plant considers mature and what we consider desirable to harvest and eat. Now, sometimes that does kind of overlap. So for example, if you harvest a tomato, you're usually harvesting a ripe fruit. So if you pick a nice ripe tomato, the seeds from that tomato will be viable, or at least for the most part, they'll be viable to grow. Something like a green bean, we usually harvest really young and immature. When you eat that green bean, the seeds inside are not going to be viable at that point. If you save the seeds from a young, tender green bean, they're not going to be mature, they're not going to grow. So now you can see some of these beans are really at the point of being completely dried up being completely mature. Obviously, there's nothing about this that looks edible or desirable, but this is perfect. This is nice and dry, and this is perfect for saving seeds. Now, if you've been following along with me this growing season, you know that I have multiple varieties of beans growing on these trellises here. So these particular really long beans that we just harvested now are a variety called Vortex. And that was my biggest priority of bean seeds to save, because these seeds are a little bit expensive and they're a little bit hard to find. So by cultivating my own supply of these, I'm able to, as I kind of mentioned before, not have to rely on the seed companies to provide me these beans. There was one year, a couple years ago, when there was some sort of crop failure with this particular variety of bean, and I wasn't able to grow it that year because no seed company had it in stock. So I found some other varieties that were delicious and I grew those instead, but this one really is my favorite and I really did miss it. So I really like being able to rely on my own garden to produce the seeds that I need for next year's garden, rather than having to rely on a seed company and kind of be at the mercy of whatever happens in their farmers' fields that year. Now, one thing I do want to mention, as I just mentioned, I do have multiple bean varieties growing on these trellises here, which means there is a possibility of cross-pollination. Now, something like a bean is self-pollinating. Basically, that means that all of the components that that bean flower needs to produce viable seeds are contained within the same flower. It doesn't need to rely on pollination from a different flower to produce viable seeds. That means that for beans, cross-pollination is a lot less likely than for something like, say, a squash or a cucumber, where there's separate male and female flowers and it really heavily relies on pollination to produce fruit and to produce seeds. That's not to say that cross-pollination isn't possible in these beans. I didn't take any measures to prevent cross-pollination. There are some things that you can do if preventing cross-pollination is really important to you, but honestly, even on the small chance that some of these beans are cross-pollinated, I think that's a risk I'm willing to take. I think they'll still be delicious and good, and we're going to try growing these seeds and see how they do. So as I mentioned, these are all seed pods from some Vortex green beans. We also have rattlesnake pole beans growing on the same trellis, so we're going to go ahead and harvest some of those as well. So I've got a handful of seed pods here from the rattlesnake beans. I actually have harvested quite a few of these already earlier in the season, but we're going to grab a few more of them. Now, I'm not going to harvest any tomato seeds today. I did harvest some earlier this season though. There was a variety that I grew that was new to me, and I grew that variety from a started plant I got at a nursery. But I really wanted to be able to grow more of that specific variety in the future, so I made sure to save seeds from that plant. Now, similarly to the beans with that tomato, I didn't take any precautions as far as preventing cross-pollination. Sometimes in the past I have done that with tomatoes. It's actually not that difficult. Basically what I do is I just take a little gauze baggie, like kind of what you might put like wedding favors or birthday party favors or something like that in. You cover up the buds of the tomato blossom before it opens, and then when it opens, you allow it to open inside the bag, and then you just kind of, as the flower is open, you kind of go out there, you blow on it or tap it gently, and you basically cause that flower to be pollinated using only its own pollen. Therefore, you're preventing any bees or other insects from carrying pollen from a different tomato variety onto that tomato. As I said, I did not do that, so it is not 100% guaranteed that the tomato seeds that I saved are not cross-pollinated. In the past, I have had tomato seeds cross-pollinate when I didn't take any precautions, but it is a little more rare, as I said, than something like a squash or zucchini or something like that. So it's a risk I'm willing to take. Now, even if those seeds are cross-pollinated, I'm still going to get a tomato. It should be somewhat similar to the tomato that I saved seeds from. So we're going to try growing those seeds together next year. We're going to see how they do. I probably should have taken the precaution of trying to prevent cross-pollination with that specific variety, because that was a variety that was pretty important to me. But we just had a lot going on, so if it doesn't work, then it's just a little experiment, and honestly, we haven't really lost that much. Now, in front of me, I see some calendula seeds that I want to save. Those grow totally differently, so let's take a look at those. I'm going to show you what those look like. So calendula doesn't even really make a seed pod. It just makes these little seeds that kind of grow on the outside of this cluster, and you can just kind of brush them off into your hand. So these calendula seeds, I don't know if you can even see them that well, they're very interesting. They almost look like tiny little curled shells, and they come in a variety of sizes and shapes. So I'm going to go ahead and save these in a little Ziploc baggie here. So you could see how with saving these seeds, I basically just waited until the stalk that they were growing on was completely dried out. When you're saving seeds from a flower or something like that that doesn't really have a noticeable fruit, you just want to make sure to wait until it's completely dried out, because by that point all of the nutrients that the plant wants to send into those seeds will be saved. Now these calendula seeds here, I don't have to worry about cross-pollination with these because I'm only growing one variety of calendula in my garden. So if you want to make absolutely 100% sure that the seeds that you're saving are not cross-pollinated, one option is to only grow one variety of each plant in your garden. Now with calendula, I'm okay with doing that. That's never going to happen with something like tomatoes or a vegetable that I'm growing to eat because I like too much variety. So I just either take measures to prevent cross-pollination, or in many cases I honestly don't even really worry about it. So here I have these beautiful cosmos flowers that I've been growing in my garden all season, and you'll see that I have some seed heads here that are really dried out. Let's see if that will focus. Now honestly with these, I'm not even really going to save these. I'm just going to kind of scatter them on the ground. And I'm hoping what happens with that is that I get some volunteer cosmos just kind of growing up wherever they decide to grow next year. I do have more cosmos seeds from that variety in my house, so I don't really have to worry about saving that variety. But if I get some volunteer plants that just kind of come up on their own, I'll definitely welcome those. So we're going to head over to the side yard garden, and we're going to take a look at some other plants that I have growing over there and just talk a little bit more about seed saving. Now I wanted to stop and take a look at these flowers on the way, just to kind of show you guys an illustration that cross-pollination is not always a bad thing. I have these beautiful fall asters growing here. Now if you take a look at this variety here, this is a deep purple variety. So when I first planted these asters in my garden, I planted two different varieties. I had that deep purple variety that I just showed you, and I also had this really bright pink variety. And over time what happened is the asters kind of reseeded themselves. And you can see I have this beautiful aster plant right behind me here. And that, I'm guessing, is a result of cross-pollination between my two varieties. Because as you can see, this is a beautiful plant. It's kind of halfway between bright pink and that deep purple. And I think what happened is, honestly, those two plants just kind of intermingled their pollen, and we ended up with a completely new variety of aster that is just as beautiful as either of the parents. So cross-pollination is not always a bad thing. Now these, I didn't save seeds from them. I just kind of let them do their own thing. They just kind of were visited by the bees, and they just scattered their seed wherever they felt like scattering it. But either way, I'm really happy that they're spreading throughout my garden. I'm completely fine that they've cross-pollinated. Now over here you can see an example of a calendula that is producing seed, but these are not ready to harvest yet. You can see it's still green, it's still receiving nutrients from the plant. So we need to let these sit for a little bit longer to be ready to harvest seeds. So when you're planting your garden and you're planning to harvest seeds, there's a couple things you're going to want to take into consideration. As I mentioned before, one thing is what the plant is like as it's mature. Now, it's pretty obvious when it comes to something like a tomato. What about something like a pepper? Now you can harvest peppers green. Many times if you let them continue ripening, they will change to a different color than green completely. If your plan is to save the seeds, your best bet is to let that pepper ripen completely. Now green peppers can be delicious and are certainly worth eating, but because their fruit is not completely mature yet, those seeds are going to they may not be viable at all. If they are, you will certainly have a lower germination rate. Because that plant still has all these nutrients it's trying to pump into those pepper seeds, they're not ready yet. So if you're planning to save seeds, your best bet is to let your peppers ripen completely to maturity. And honestly, for the highest chance of success, for both peppers, tomatoes, any kind of fruit, you want to let it ripen almost to the point of it being not quite rotten, but more than you'd really want to eat it. Now, practically speaking, I don't do that because I still want to eat my tomatoes. I don't want to sacrifice some tomatoes just for the purpose of saving seed. So I just harvest my tomatoes when I actually want to eat them. That may slightly lower the germination rate of the seeds that I get, but that's a sacrifice that I'm willing to make. So that's a compromise that the plant and I can both live with. So now when it comes to something that you don't necessarily harvest for the fruit, if you're thinking something like lettuce or something that you harvest for the leaves, it can be a little bit trickier to think about saving seeds from a plant like that. Generally what happens is if you're saving seeds from a plant that you don't harvest as a fruit that has seeds in it, you're going to need to wait longer than you would normally wait to harvest it. You want to wait for that plant to flower. Seeds are produced from the flower, and so if you give that plant a chance to flower, so for example, when your lettuce starts to bolt, many gardeners use that term in the summer when your lettuce stops producing new leaves, sends up a stalk, and the leaves turn really bitter. The reason that that happens is because your lettuce has kind of shifted gears from producing delicious leaves to trying to produce seed to ensure the next generation. At that point, your plant will bolt and send up a center stalk. If you let it go past that point, what will happen is on that center stalk, it will develop lots of little flowers. And those flowers will ultimately produce seeds. So if you're harvesting something that you don't normally eat for the fruits, where the seeds may not necessarily be as obvious, just let it go a little bit longer, wait for the flower, and at that point it will produce some type of fruit or seed pod, or at some point you'll be able to figure out where you harvest the seeds from. So that's just something to keep in mind for things that might be a little bit less obvious for harvesting seeds. Another thing that you may want to take into consideration when you're planning to save seeds is what type of variety you're growing, whether it's heirloom, whether it's open pollinated, or whether you're growing a hybrid plant. Now, a lot of people have the misconception that you can only save seeds from heirloom varieties, and that's really not true. Basically, if you have an heirloom variety or an open pollinated variety, as far as seed saving is concerned, you can treat those two varieties interchangeably. You can treat those two categories interchangeably, I should say. Basically, if you have an heirloom or an open pollinated plant, as long as those seeds are not cross-pollinated, you can save the seeds and know that what you're going to get from those seeds is going to be the same as the parent plant. Now, when you have a hybrid plant, it's a little bit different. You can still save seeds from the hybrid. In most cases, they'll still grow. They'll still be at least fairly similar to the plant that you harvested the seeds from. So if you save seeds from a hybrid tomato, you will still get a tomato that will probably at least somewhat be like the parent tomato plant. But the difference is that a hybrid plant is not stabilized. Basically, there's genetics from multiple plants being combined to make that plant. So if you cross-pollinated two completely different tomato varieties intentionally and then save the seeds, you'll end up with a third tomato variety that isn't completely like either of the originals. That's basically what a hybrid is. It just uses pollen from one variety to pollinate a different variety, and therefore the seeds will combine the characteristics of both plants. That doesn't mean you can't save seeds. What it does mean is that saving seeds is going to be a little bit of a gamble. You don't really know exactly what you're going to get. Now, you may end up with something amazing that you like better than either of the parents. You may end up with something you don't like as much. But you should still end up with something that's edible and fairly similar. So most people, when they're planning to save seeds, will grow either heirloom or open pollinated varieties. I personally don't save seeds from hybrids, even though it can be done. I save seeds from heirlooms and open pollinated varieties because that way I know what I'm getting. So that's just something to keep in mind and take into consideration when you're deciding what varieties to grow. Personally, the majority of plants that I grow in my garden have been heirloom and open pollinated because I like the freedom of saving the seeds and knowing exactly what I'm going to get. So let's take a look at these bean pods and see what these seeds are like on the inside. So as I said, I have two varieties here. I'm not going to really worry about combining them too much because the seeds themselves look pretty distinct, but I'm just going to show you what they look like inside. So let's start with this Vortex green bean. Just going to open it up. You can see the seeds inside. So you can see the seeds from these Vortex green beans. These look nice and dark and fully developed. So these should hopefully lead to nice healthy plants for me next year. This is a rattlesnake bean pod, so I'm going to open these up just to show you guys the difference in seeds. So these are rattlesnake bean seeds. You can see they're lighter in color for the most part. There's a couple dark ones here, but they're speckled and they're smaller than the others. So there is definitely some variety. So seed saving is something that I'm trying to be a lot more serious about over the past couple years, and honestly, I still have a long ways to go with that. I have saved more seeds this year than I have from any previous garden, and I want to continue learning to save more seeds and just get more experience with that. Just because it's a great skill to have. At the very least, it's going to save you a lot of money in your garden. If you don't have to purchase the same seeds year after year, you're just closing that loop a little bit more. You're saving yourself some money, and you're guaranteeing yourself just a steady supply of that variety of plant. So that's definitely something that I want to improve on, and it's something that I encourage you to look into as well, because honestly, it's fun, it's empowering, and it just gives you that little bit extra boost of food security that I think is so valuable, especially with the world being so uncertain in so many ways right now. I would love to hear your favorite seed saving tips. I'm sure there are plenty of seed saving tips that I did not share in this video, so I would love to hear from you guys. And I would love to hear your favorite plants to save seeds from, so go ahead and let me know that in the comments. So I hope that you're all having a great day. I hope that you're enjoying your garden, even though, at least here in Connecticut, I know the garden is kind of winding down, but I am still enjoying it. I'm still soaking in as much outdoor time and beautiful weather as I can before it gets cold and dark and the frost has killed my garden. I'm going to enjoy it as long as I can. So I hope you're all having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.